The American West was built on two things: blood and property, and Silas Vance was about to pay for both in a currency he didn't know he possessed. Imagine standing in the choking, sulfurous dust of a box canyon, your revolver still smoking from the execution of 4 guards, only to realize the woman trembling at the end of your barrel is wearing the same gold wedding band you placed on her finger 3 months ago in a candlelit mission church. This isn't just a tale of highway robbery gone wrong. It's the visceral account of a man who spent 3 years sharpening his hate into a razor, only to cut his own throat with it. Silas Vance was a ghost, a seeker of a righteous, bloody justice against the Thorne family. The aristocrats who used ink and paper to drive his father to a rope in a lonely barn. He thought he was the ultimate predator, marrying the heiress Clara Thorne under a false name just to learn her secrets and dismantle her life from the inside. He called it strategy. The universe called it a death sentence. As the bandana falls from his face in the wreckage of a shattered stagecoach, the look of soul-crushing horror in Clara's eyes reveals the ultimate irony. The vengeance he craved was a lie, and the woman he swore to kill was the only person who came west to save him. Stick around, because what follows is a descent into a psychological and bullet-riddled hell that proves that in the desert, the altar and the gallows are often made from the very same wood. The atmosphere in Dead Man's Pass was a physical weight, a suffocating, stagnant pressure that felt like the earth itself was holding its breath, waiting for the first drop of warm blood to hit the parched, alkaline sand. Silas Vance sat motionless atop a jagged shelf of obsidian, his long leather duster coated in a fine layer of white dust that made him look like a crumbling, forgotten monument to a god of wrath. He watched the horizon with the predatory, unblinking stillness of a mountain lion, his eyes narrowed against the blinding, white-hot glare of the midday sun that turned the desert into a shimmering, liquid hall of mirrors. In his vest pocket, the gold wedding band felt like a brand, a scorching circle of iron that reminded him of every whispered lie and every deceptive caress he had used to orchestrate this moment of ruin. He could still smell the expensive, floral ink on the eviction papers that had destroyed his family, a scent that had become synonymous with death in the dark corners of his mind. His father, Elias Vance, had been a man of the soil, a man who believed that a handshake was a holy covenant written in granite. When the high-collared Thorne lawyers arrived with their soft, manicured hands and their labyrinthine legalities, Elias hadn't understood how a mere scrap of paper could override 30 years of sweat, broken bones, and the very blood that had nourished the Vance legacy. Silas had watched the fire in his father's eyes slowly turn to ash, the pride of a lifetime extinguished in a single afternoon of legalized thievery and calculated greed. He remembered with a haunting clarity the night he found his father in the barn, the way the desert wind had rattled the loose tin on the roof, sounding like a slow, rhythmic applause for the tragedy unfolding in the shadows. That was the night the rancher's son died, and the Sombra was born from the cold embers of despair. He had spent years in the lawless fringes of the frontier, learning the violent language of the gun and the lethal rhythm of the ambush, all to lead him back to this specific trail, to this specific moment of reckoning. The dust cloud on the horizon grew into a towering pillar of gray, signaling the approach of the Concord stagecoach and the end of his agonizing wait. He checked the action on his Winchester, the metallic slide sounding like a bone snapping in the heavy silence of the canyon. He had recruited the most desperate, soul-dead men he could find, killers like Black Dog and Whiskey Pete, men who didn't ask questions as long as the payoff was measured in gold. They knew nothing of Clara. They knew nothing of the secret, feverish wedding in the back of a dusty mission church where Silas had traded his soul for a chance to get close to the Thorne bloodline. They only knew that a high-value target was coming through the pass with a fortune in her hold. Silas felt a sudden, sharp pang of vertigo as the coach rounded the bend. The Thorne crest, a golden eagle, painted on the door, mocking him with its unearned opulence. He raised his hand, his pulse thumping in his ears like a war drum, a rhythmic pounding that drowned out the sound of his own breathing. Steady, he hissed to the wind. but his voice was nothing more than the sound of dry leaves skittering across a fresh grave. When he finally dropped his hand, the world fractured into 1,000 shards of violence. The first volley of gunfire was a deafening, overlapping roar that echoed off the canyon walls, transforming the serene mountain pass into a chaotic matadero in a heartbeat. The lead horses screamed, a high, terrifyingly human sound, as they tumbled into the grit in a tangle of thrashing limbs and shredded leather, bringing the entire coach down in a violent heap of splintered hickory and snapping iron. Silas was the first one down the rocky slope, his duster billowing behind him like the wings of a scavenger bird. He moved through the acrid, swirling gunsmoke with a terrifying, ghost-like grace, his revolvers barking with a rhythmic, deadly precision that left no room for mercy. He watched the guards fall, men with names, men with families, men simply earning a wage, but he felt nothing but the cold, hollow vacuum of his singular mission. He reached the wreckage of the coach, his heart a block of frozen iron. He kicked the door off its remaining hinges with a violence that spoke of a decade of repressed rage. He expected to find a monster inside, a cold-hearted aristocrat who traded in human misery for silk dresses. Instead, he found Clara. She was huddled on the floorboards, her fine dress torn and stained with soot, her face pale as a ghost under the layer of desert grime. Her eyes were wide with a terror that bypassed the intellect and struck deep into the primal core of her soul. But when she looked at him, when she saw the man behind the mask, the terror transformed into something far worse, a profound, agonizing recognition that shattered the very air between them. "Jack," she whispered, using the name of the man she thought she had married. The man who had promised her a life of peace far from the predatory shadows of her father's empire. Silas froze, his finger tightening on the trigger of his Colt Peacemaker until his knuckles turned white. The world seemed to stall, the screams of the dying and the smell of burnt powder receding into a distant, muffled background. He looked at her trembling hand, clutching the velvet seat cushion, and saw the twin to the ring in his pocket, the gold catching the harsh light of the noon sun. The realization hit him like a physical blow to the solar plexus, a sickening wave of nausea that made the very ground beneath his boots feel unstable. He had spent months meticulously planning this execution, using his forced intimacy with her to learn every travel route, every guard rotation, and every personal vulnerability. He had convinced himself it was a tactical necessity, a cold-blooded means to a righteous end. But as he stood there, looking at the woman who had shared his bed and his secrets, he realized he hadn't been playing a game of chess with an enemy. He had been digging his own grave with a wedding ring. Black Dog stepped up behind him, his face twisted into a predatory, yellow-toothed grin as he aimed his shotgun at the interior of the coach. "Found a thorn bitch, did we? Let's see if she's got the keys to the lockbox, or if I have to cut them out of her." The outlaw moved forward, his hand reaching for Clara's throat, and something in Silas finally snapped like a dry branch in a storm. The years of accumulated hate, the thirst for a bloody justice, the ghost of his father, all of it was eclipsed in an instant by a sudden, violent, and irrational need to protect the woman he was supposed to murder. He swiveled his revolver, the barrel pressing hard into Black Dog's temple before the man could even register the betrayal. "Step back," Silas growled, his voice sounding like it was being pulled from the bottom of a deep, dark well. "She is mine. The gold, the deeds, the horses, take it all and vanish into the hills. But if you touch a single hair on her head, I will dismantle you piece by piece and leave what's left for the vultures." The tension in the canyon reached a lethal breaking point, his own men looking at him with a mixture of confused greed and murderous intent. Silas knew he had just signed his own death warrant. He had betrayed his brotherhood of thieves. He had failed the memory of his father, and he had revealed the blackness of his soul to the only person who ever truly loved him. He grabbed Clara's arm, pulling her from the splintered remains of her life, and began a desperate, lung-searing scramble up the jagged, rocky slopes. The sound of his own men's curses and the first cracks of their retaliatory gunfire, following them like a pack of starving wolves. Every step was an agony of physical exertion and soul-crushing regret. He had sought a vengeance that ended in a fatal mistake of the heart, and now, as the sun began to dip behind the serrated peaks of the mountains, casting long, bloody shadows across the wasteland, Silas Vance realized the heaviest chain a man can ever wear isn't made of iron or forged in a prison. It's a simple circle of gold, worn on the finger of a hand that is already dripping with the blood of the innocent. He led her toward the high, hidden caves of the Rimrock, a place of freezing shadows and ancient, judgmental silence, where the truth would finally have to be stripped bare. They sat in the oppressive darkness, the only sound the distant, mocking howl of a coyote and the ragged, broken breathing of two people who had been utterly destroyed by a single signature on a piece of paper and a single promise made in the dark. "Why?" Clara finally asked, her voice a fragile ghost of the laughter he had once cherished. Silas looked at his hands, unable to distinguish where the desert dirt ended and the blood of her protectors began. "Because in this country, Clara, you are either the hammer or the anvil. And I spent too long watching my father break upon the anvil of your name." He began to pour out the story then, the stolen ranch, the legal thievery, the sight of his father's body swaying in the barn. He didn't ask for her forgiveness. He knew the soil of the West was too dry for mercy to grow. He showed her the deeds he had snatched from the wreckage, the papers that proved she was now the owner of the very ground his father was buried in. But Clara didn't look at the deeds. She looked at him with a pity that felt more agonizing than a gut shot. "I didn't know, Silas," she whispered, her voice cracking like dry timber. "I found my father's private ledgers after he died. I found the record of what he did to the Van Cess. I didn't come west to claim the land. I came to find you. I came to give it all back." The irony was the final, twisting knife in the heart of his resolve. He had murdered 4 men for the very thing she was bringing him as a gift of atonement. His fatal mistake wasn't the ambush or the robbery. It was allowing the poison of hate to blind him to the grace of the woman he had called his wife. Outside, the flickering lanterns of a growing posse appeared in the valley below like grounded, vengeful stars, coming for the man who had finally run out of places to run, lies to tell. He looked at the ring on her finger one last time, realizing that even if he survived the night, he was already a ghost haunting the ruins of a life that could have been. The silence inside the high Rimrock cavern was not a void, but a heavy, suffocating presence that seemed to pulse with the rhythmic, agonizing throb of Silas Vance's own heartbeat. The air was stagnant, tasting of ancient dust and the sharp, metallic tang of the blood that had dried on his knuckles during the frantic scramble up the jagged mountain face. Silas sat with his back against the weeping stone wall, the cold granite seeping through his sweat-soaked duster, while he watched the flickering tallow candle cast long, distorted shadows that danced like vengeful ghosts across the ceiling. Each flame flicker seemed to recreate the moment of the ambush. The splintering wood, the screams of the dying horses, and the horrific instant the bandana fell to reveal his true face to the woman he had sworn to protect in a different life. Clara sat across from him, her silk dress a ruined web of filth and thorns, her eyes fixed on the gold band on her finger with a hollow intensity that made Silas want to scream. The ring was no longer a symbol of love. It was a shackle, a golden link in a chain of deceit that he had forged with his own hands. He reached out to touch the heavy leather satchel containing the land deeds, the very papers that had fueled his hatred for a decade. But his fingers recoiled as if the parchment were made of white-hot iron. He had spent 10 years imagining the triumph of this moment, the day he would hold the Thorn legacy in his hand and crush it into the dirt. But the victory was a mouthful of bitter ash. He had murdered 4 men to reclaim a ranch that was already being returned to him as an act of grace. The irony was a jagged blade twisting in his lungs, making every breath a physical labor. "Say something," Silas finally whispered, his voice a guttural rasp that sounded like dry leaves skittering across a grave. Clara didn't look up. She didn't even seem to hear him. She was lost in the wreckage of the man she called Jack, searching for a trace of the lover who had read her poetry in the moonlight, only to find a butcher hiding behind a mask of scars. When she finally spoke, her voice was a fragile, broken thread in the gloom. My father was a thief, Silas. I knew that the moment I found the hidden ledgers in his study after the funeral. I saw the names of the families he broke, the Van Cess, the Miller boys, the old widows in Green Valley. I saw the bribes paid to the circuit judges and the way he used the railroad to choke the life out of the honest men. I didn't come west to build a kingdom on their bones. I came to find you. I came to find the son of Elias Vance and give him back the soul of his father's land. Silas felt a wave of nausea crash over him, a visceral realization that his entire identity as a vengeful ghost was a lie. He had nurtured his hate like a sacred flame, feeding it with every robbery and every kill, only to realize he had been burning down the very bridge that led to his salvation. He had married her under a false name to infiltrate her life, to find the weaknesses in the Thorn Empire, but in the process, he had found the only thing capable of healing his own shattered spirit. And then, in a fit of blind, righteous fury, he had tried to murder the cure. The fatal mistake of the ambush was not just a tactical error. It was a spiritual suicide. Outside the cave, the world was moving toward its violent conclusion. He could hear the distant, rhythmic thumping of horses' hooves vibrating through the mountain stone. Black Dog and the rest of the gang were not going to let the Thorn bitch or the gold escape their grasp. They were predators who lived by the code of the wolf, and they sensed the weakness in their leader. Below them, in the valley floor, the flickering lanterns of the sheriff's posse were spreading out like a slow-moving wildfire, closing the exits of the canyon with a cold, legal inevitability. Silas stood up, his joints popping like pistol shots in the silence. He checked the cylinders of his Colts, the metallic clicks echoing through the cavern like the ticking of a doomsday clock. He had 12 rounds left in his belts and a rifle with a jammed lever. It was the math of a dead man. He looked at Clara, realizing that the only way to truly honor the land he had lost was to lose himself in the process of saving her. He grabbed her arm, his grip firm but no longer violent, and led her toward the back of the cave where a narrow, hidden trail led over the crest toward the northern flats. "You listen to me, Clara," he hissed, his eyes searching hers for a spark of the woman who had loved him. "Black Dog is coming for the deeds and the gold. He doesn't care about the blood. The sheriff is coming for the man who robbed the stage. I'm going to give them both what they want. I'm going to lead them into the box canyon at the base of the pass. You take the horse I left in the draw. You ride until your lungs burn, and you don't stop until you reach the federal land office in Laramie. You give them those papers. You tell them Silas Vance died a long time ago, and Jack never existed." He pressed the deeds into her trembling hands, the parchment feeling like a holy relic between them. He saw the flicker of a protest in her eyes, the ghost of a love that refused to die even in the face of such monstrous betrayal. But he silenced her with a look of such profound, weary sorrow that she finally nodded. He watched her disappear into the shadows of the rear tunnel, her footsteps fading into the silence, leaving him alone with the cold stone and the ghosts of his own making. Silas Vance stepped out into the pre-dawn light of the rimrock, the air freezing and thin, the horizon bleeding a violent, bruised purple. He could see the dust clouds of his hunters rising in the distance. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the gold wedding band, staring at it for a long, agonizing moment before tossing it into the abyss of the canyon below. He didn't need the ring to remember the weight of his sins. He raised his Winchester, the wood stock cold against his cheek, and waited for the first silhouette of a rider to appear. He had spent a lifetime seeking a vengeance that had ended in a fatal mistake, but in this final, desperate stand, he would find the only justice the West ever truly offered, a clean death in the dirt of the land he had once called home. He pulled the trigger, and the roar of the rifle shattered the morning, signaling the beginning of the end for the man who had married his enemy and found his soul just in time to lose it. Every shot he fired was a heartbeat he was buying for Clara, a second of life he was stealing back from the darkness he had invited into their lives. The bullets hummed through the air like angry hornets, striking the rocks around him, But Silas didn't flinch. He was a man who had already accepted his execution. As the first rider of the posse fell from his horse in a spray of crimson, Silas felt a strange, hollow peace settle over him. He was no longer the Sombra, and he was no longer Jack. He was just Silas Vance, a man who had finally realized that the price of a stolen life is a debt that can only be paid in lead and shadows. He fanned the hammer of his Colt, the world dissolving into a haze of white smoke and the smell of sulfur, while the sun rose over the mountains to witness the final, bloody harvest of a revenge that had cost him everything. The descent from the high rim rock was not merely a physical journey. It was a slow, agonizing crawl through the wreckage of a man's shattered conscience. Silas Vance felt every jagged edge of the shale slicing through the soles of his worn boots, a rhythmic, grinding reminder that the very ground he had spent a lifetime trying to reclaim was now conspiring to tear him apart. The air in the lower canyon had begun to bake as the sun reached its zenith, a relentless, white-hot eye that watched the unfolding tragedy with the cold, celestial indifference of an ancient god. Silas moved with a deliberate, bone-weary slowness, his leather duster heavy with the weight of the gold coins that clinked with a mocking, rhythmic metal-on-metal sound against his thighs, a sound that echoed off the sandstone walls and signaled his exact position to every predator stalking the shadows. Every muscle in his body screamed in a cacophony of protest, his knees buckling under the cumulative strain of a decade of hard riding and harder living. But the roar in his mind was louder, a turbulent storm of Clara's tear-streaked face and the ghost of his father's judgmental, hollow stare from the rafters of that lonely, cursed barn. He was leading a dance of death, drawing the heat of the lawman's posse and the savage, feral blood hunger of Black Dog's gang away from the narrow draw where Clara lay hidden, and every breath he drew felt like swallowing a mouthful of heated needles and pulverized glass. He reached the floor of the box canyon, a natural kill box of red sandstone and stunted, twisted sagebrush that smelled of dust and old rot, where the shadows were long, sharp, and black like the blades of a waiting guillotine. He could hear them now, the rhythmic, heavy thumping of unshod horses and the distant, guttural shouts of men who had abandoned their humanity in a gutter long ago in exchange for the promise of easy wealth and a bottle of rot-gut whiskey. Black Dog was close. Silas could smell the familiar, pungent odor of the man's cheap, sun-cured tobacco and the sour, pervasive scent of unwashed hate that trailed behind him like a heavy funeral shroud. Silas checked the chambers of his revolvers, the cold, oily steel of the cylinders clicking with a finality that echoed through the silence of the gorge like the ticking of a clock at an execution. He had 6 rounds in each Colt and 10 in his Winchester. 22 chances to buy Clara a few more minutes of life. 22 stolen breaths before the inevitable, suffocating dark. He took cover behind a massive, lightning-scarred juniper tree, its twisted, silvered limbs reaching toward the indifferent sky like the fossilized hands of a drowning man. He didn't have to wait long. The first rider appeared at the mouth of the canyon, a jagged silhouette of violence against the shimmering, liquid heat haze that made the rocks look like they were melting into the sand. It was Whiskey Pete, his face a road map of scars, broken veins, and the history of 1,000 barroom brawls, his eyes narrowed with the predatory greed of a starving coyote. Silas didn't hesitate. He didn't allow himself the luxury of a second thought or a flicker of mercy. He raised the Winchester, the worn walnut stock biting into his shoulder with a familiar, brutal intimacy, and squeezed the trigger. The crack of the rifle shattered the heavy silence of the canyon like a hammer through a stained glass window, and Pete was jerked backward off his horse, as if by an invisible, celestial rope, his lifeblood spraying across the dry, silver sage in a fan of brilliant, wasted crimson that looked almost black in the harsh light. The riderless horse bolted, its stirrups clashing like bells of war, and the canyon erupted into a hell's cape of returned fire, metallic clattering, and screamed curses that sounded more like animal howls than human speech. Silas ducked behind the trunk as a hail of lead tore into the wood, sending sharp splinters of ancient juniper flying into his face like jagged, wooden insects. He moved with a frantic, desperate energy, sliding through the brush to a secondary position, his boots treading on the very soil he had once hoped to own with Clara, now just a place for him to bleed out and be forgotten. He saw another flash of movement. A man named Dutch, a cold-blooded killer from the territory who had once boasted about shooting a man for his boots, and Silas fanned the hammer of his Colt. The 3 rapid shots sounding like a single, continuous roar of thunder. Dutch crumpled into the dirt, his hands clutching a stomach wound that would never heal in this life, his screams joining the howling wind that tore through the pass with a vengeful spirit. But Silas was running out of ground, and he knew it. Every grain of sand seemed to vibrate with the tension of the standoff. He could hear Black Dog laughing now, a dry, hacking sound that echoed off the rocks. "You're a dead man, Vance. You gave up a kingdom for a piece of silk." The outlaw screamed, his voice cracking with a mixture of rage and twisted amusement. Silas looked at the gold band he had kept in his pocket, now covered in a fine layer of canyon dust. He thought of the small mission church, the smell of old incense, and the way Clara's hand had trembled when he slid the ring onto her finger. He had told himself then that it was part of the plan, a necessary lie to facilitate the theft of her life. But he knew now that the lie had become the only truth he had left. He stood up, his duster billowing like a dark flag of surrender that was anything but, and stepped into the open. He was Silas Vance, son of Elias, husband of Clara, and he was the final barrier between the wolves and the woman who had come save him. He raised both Colts, his vision blurring slightly from the blood loss and the heat, and prepared for the final, bloody harvest. He could feel the eyes of his former brothers watching him from the ridges, their rifles leveled, their hearts empty of everything but the desire for his destruction. He remembered a time when they would have died for him, but that time was as dead as his father's ranch. He felt the cold iron of the trigger against his finger, a familiar sensation that usually brought a sense of power, but now it only brought a deep, hollow exhaustion. He wasn't Silas Vance anymore, and he wasn't Jack. He was just a man at the end of a long, blood-soaked road, standing between the woman he loved and the monsters he had created. He let out a long, shaky breath, the dust coating his tongue and his throat, and stepped out from behind the cover, his guns leveled, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the justice of the West waited with an iron grin and a hollow heart. As the first of Black Dog's men charged from behind a boulder, Silas didn't feel fear. He felt a strange, detached curiosity about the coming dark. He had lived his life in the service of a ghost, and it was only fitting that he should join that ghost in the silence of the canyon. The first bullet hit him in the side, a hot, searing pain that made the world tilt, but he didn't fall. He fired back, his shots finding their mark with a deadly, instinctive precision that came from a lifetime of violence. The man fell, but there were others behind him, a never-ending tide of hate and greed that Silas knew he couldn't stop forever. He was a man made of meat and bone, and the iron of the West was stronger. He felt another impact, this one in his thigh, and he went down to one knee, the red sand soaking into his trousers. He looked up at the sky, the blue so bright it hurt his eyes, and he thought of Clara. He hoped she was far away by now, riding toward a life where the name Vance didn't mean anything but a memory of a man who tried to be better than he was. He raised his guns one last time, the barrels heavy as lead, and prepared to meet the final charge. The sounds of the battle seemed to fade away, replaced by a strange, peaceful silence that filled his head. He could see his father standing in the distance, beckoning him toward a place where the grass was green and the water was sweet. He smiled, a small, bloody secret shared with the desert, and pulled the triggers until the hammers clicked on empty chambers. He had done his part. He had held the line, and now the West could have what was left of him. The first bullet to find Silas Vance didn't feel like metal. It felt like a splash of boiling water against his ribs, a searing, white-hot intrusion that stole the oxygen from his lungs and replaced it with the copper taste of his own mortality. He didn't stumble. He couldn't afford the luxury of falling. Not while Black Dog was still laughing from the ridges and the scent of Clara's lavender perfume still lingered in the phantom reaches of his memory. He pivoted on a heel ground into the red grit, fanning the hammer of his right-hand Colt with a mechanical, obsessive rhythm that bypassed his brain and went straight to the muscle memory of 1,000 lawless nights. The man who had shot him, a scrawny thief named Lanky Bill, didn't even have time to celebrate his Mark IV Silas's lead tore through his throat, turning his victory shout into a wet, gurgling whistle of death. Silas watched him fall in a disjointed heap of limbs, but there was no satisfaction in it, only the grim calculation of a man running out of time and iron. The canyon was now a swirling vortex of sulfurous yellow smoke and the high-pitched hum of ricochets singing off the sandstone walls like angry hornets. Every inch of the air felt thick, heavy with the weight of spent powder and the desperate finality of a standoff that had no exit. Silas felt a second impact, a blunt force trauma to his left shoulder that spun him around, nearly stripping the ivory-handled revolver from his grip. He hit the ground on one knee, the impact jarring his teeth, the dry earth beneath him already beginning to darken with a wet, spreading stain of his own Vance blood. "Is that all you got, Silas?" Black Dog's voice boomed, amplified by the natural acoustics of the box canyon, sounding like the voice of a god of ruin. "You're dying for a woman who will forget your name before the moon rises. You're dying for a ranch that's nothing but dust and death." Silas spat a mouthful of blood into the sand and forced himself back up, his duster heavy and sodden, clinging to his frame like a shroud he wasn't quite ready to wear. He looked at the Winchester lying a few feet away, its lever jammed by a piece of canyon grit, a perfect metaphor for his own broken life. He ignored it, drawing his second Colt with a hand that shook not from fear, but from the rapid, inevitable onset of shock. He was a man made of meat and bone, standing against a tide of iron and avarice, but he was anchored by a singular, burning truth. Clara had the deeds. She was the vessel for his family's resurrection, and as long as he drew breath, the wolves would stay in the valley. He moved again, a staggered, limping run toward a secondary outcrop of rock, his boots leaving a jagged, bloody trail that the desert would soon erase. Another rider charged him, swinging a heavy cavalry saber, a relic of the war, aiming to take Silas's head as a trophy. Silas waited until he could see the yellow in a man's eyes, until he could smell the horse's panic sweat. Then he fired once, twice, the bullets punching through the rider's chest and sending him tumbling backward over the horse's rump. The world was beginning to narrow now, the edges of his vision fringed with a creeping, gray darkness that he knew was the shadow of the hangman's noose finally catching up to him. He thought of his father, Elias, and wondered if the old man was watching from whatever silent pasture he now inhabited. Would he be proud of the son who had become a murderer to save a thief? Or would he see the ring on Silas's finger, the gold band he had tucked away like a secret, and understand that the only way to heal the land was through a sacrifice of the heart? The pain in his side was now a dull, throbbing roar, a rhythmic reminder that his clock was ticking down to its final second. He saw Black Dog emerge from the rocks above, the leader of the pack finally coming down to finish the kill himself. The man looked enormous in the distorted light of the afternoon sun, a mountain of black leather and cold intent. Silas raised both of his revolvers, the weight of them feeling like anchor stones, his vision blurring as the heat haze fused the sky and the sand into a single, terrifying wall of red. "This was your fatal mistake, Jack," Black Dog screamed, using the name that Silas had used to marry the heiress, the name of the man who didn't exist. Silas didn't argue. He didn't explain. He simply stood his ground, a broken man in a broken land, and waited for the final exchange of iron. He felt the gold ring in his pocket shift as he moved, a small, circular weight that felt more significant than all the bullion in the thorn vaults. He had married his enemy, and in doing so, he had found the only friend he ever truly had. He squeezed the triggers one last time, the hammers clicking on empty chambers, a hollow, mocking sound that signaled the end of his war. He dropped the guns, his hands falling to his sides, and watched as Black Dog leveled his own rifle. This was the harvest. This was the price. And as the first shot of the final volley struck his chest, Silas Vance didn't feel the lead. He felt the wind of the high plains, the smell of fresh rain on the Vance ranch, and the soft, distant sound of Clara's voice telling him that the land was finally free. He fell backward, the red sand of the canyon rising up to meet him like a bed of velvet. And for the first time in 10 years, the Sombra was at peace. Silas Vance stood in the absolute center of that godforsaken box canyon, feeling the world shrink down to the diameter of a rusted bullet hole, while the red dust swirled around his worn leather boots like the restless ashes of life he had already burned to the ground with his own 2 hands, and a heart that had been forged in the cold, unyielding furnace of malice and a decade of silence. There was no glory left in the stagnant air of the gorge, only the acrid, suffocating stench of spent black powder that burned the back of his throat, and the heavy metallic iron smell of his own lifeblood soaking through the thick layers of his duster and dripping onto the parched, unfeeling earth with a rhythmic hollow sound that felt like a death knell tolling for a man who had been a ghost long before the lead finally found his flesh in this final hour of reckoning. He could hear the heavy labored breathing of Black Dog just a few yards away, a man who was not just a rival, but a mirror image of every dark impulse Silas had ever nurtured, and every sin he had ever committed in the name of vengeance that had turned out to be a hollow, deceptive lie designed by a cruel and indifferent universe to strip him of the last remnants of his humanity. Every time Silas blinked his eyes against the stinging salt of his own sweat, he saw Clara's eyes not filled with the warmth and love of a wife, as they had been in that quiet mission church, but filled with the shattering, bone-deep realization that the man she had married was the very devil who had hunted her family across the plains with a predatory hunger that knew no mercy and no end. He realized in that final freezing moment of clarity as the sun hammered down on his aching shoulders like a blacksmith hammer that he had become the monster to fight a monster, and in doing so he had built a cosmic cage of hate that had finally trapped the only person worth saving in this godforsaken world, and now he was the only one who could unlock it with the key of his own demise. The weight of the stolen gold in his bags felt like leaden anchors pulling him down into the dirt of a land that had already claimed his father's sanity and his mother's soul, but his eyes remained fixed on the northern ridge, watching for that one final plume of dust that would tell him she was safe, that she was riding away from this carnage with the deeds and the truth and a chance to wash the Vance name clean of the blood he had spilled so recklessly. Across the territory, he felt the cold ivory of his revolvers against his palms, a familiar weight that had been his only true companion for a decade of shadows, and he knew that the math of the desert was finally coming for him with a cold and calculating finality that allowed for no more lies and no more hidden agendas. When the first shot rang out, it wasn't a hero's entrance, but a brutal intrusion of lead that shattered his collarbone and sent a jolt of white-hot, blinding agony through his spine, making him drop to one knee in the dirt while the world tilted on its axis, and the sky turned a violent, bruised shade of purple that looked like a fresh wound in the atmosphere. He didn't scream because he had no breath left for anything but the final act of a man who had realized his fatal mistake far too late to fix the wreckage of his own life or the hearts he had broken along the way. He fanned the hammer of his Colt with a mechanical desperation born of 1,000 gunfights, watching as Black Dog's chest erupted in a spray of crimson that looked like spilled wine against the dying light of the sunset, and he watched the light go out of his enemy's eyes with a sense of profound and weary emptiness that no amount of gold or reclaimed land could ever fill. There was no satisfaction in the kill, only the crushing exhaustion of a man who had finally finished a job he never should have started in the first place, and now had to face the bill for his own existence. The posse was rounding the bend, now a wall of iron and law and hollow justice that came too late for his father and too late for his soul, and Silas didn't even raise his weapons against them because he knew the price of his vengeance was finally due in full, and he was ready to pay it. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out the small gold wedding band the twin to the one Clara was still wearing as she rode toward a life without him, and he squeezed it so hard the sharp edges cut into his palm, mixing his blood with the gold in a final silent pact of regret that would be buried with him in the red sand. He looked up at the indifferent blue of the sky and realized that the Old West didn't care about his reasons or his heart or the way he had tried to trade his life for hers at the very end of the trail, when he had finally run out of places to hide and people to kill. He felt the impact of the lawman's volley, a series of sharp, hot stings that felt almost gentle compared to the guilt that had been eating him alive since the first moment he saw her face in the wreckage of the coach and realized he had married the woman he was supposed to murder. He fell backward into the red sand, his duster billowing out like a shadow across the earth. And as the darkness began to pull at the edges of his mind, he heard the sound of the wind through the high grass of a ranch that no longer belonged to him, but would now belong to her and the children she might one day have. He was Silas Vance, and he was Jack, and he was a ghost of a man who had spent his whole life planting seeds of hate and had finally found a single flower of mercy in the ruins of his own destruction, just as the light failed for the last time. As his pulse slowed to a crawl, he could feel the desert reclaiming him, the dust settling into his pores, and the sun warming his cold skin for one last second of existence before the cold of the night took over. He thought of the words he never got to say to her, the apologies that would have been drowned out by the sound of gunfire anyway, and he felt a strange sense of peace knowing that the cycle of blood was finally broken and the land would be quiet again. The land would remember him not as a hero or a villain, but as a warning whispered in the wind that vengeance is a fire that eventually consumes the one who carries the torch and leaves nothing but white bone and black ash. His fingers loosened around the ring, letting it fall into the dust where it would wait for the centuries to bury it alongside the bones of the men who fought for things they could never truly own in a world that belonged only to the wind and the stars. The sheriff approached his body with a cautious step, his rifle leveled, but Silas was already gone, traveling a path where the law of the gun couldn't follow and where the ghosts of his past were finally silent. The sky turned to a deep starless black as the canyon fell into a silent repose, and the only thing left was the distant sound of a horse galloping toward a future that was finally free of the shadow of the Vance name and the heavy burden of his mistakes. Silas had married his enemy, and in the end he had found that the only way to win the war was to let himself be conquered by the love he had tried so hard to use as a weapon against a woman who only wanted to give him back his home. His eyes remained open, staring at the stars he had once navigated by in the lonely nights of his youth, and for the first time since he was a boy in his father's house, he wasn't afraid of the dark because he knew he had finally done one thing right in a life of many wrongs. The vultures would come in the morning and the wind would blow away his tracks, but the deeds in Clara's hand were real and the land was safe, and that was more than a man like Silas Vance had any right to expect from a world as cruel as this one. He was finally a part of the soil he loved, a permanent fixture of the territory he had stained with blood, now feeding the earth with his own remains as the final payment for a debt that had been decades in the making and seconds in the settling.